So first of all, I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you very much to Thomas for inviting me. I think that there should be way more events where people from the human sciences and from the life sciences meet. I hope what I'm presenting convinces you of this. So the official title of my talk is an anthropology of microbes. What that means is that I, as anthropologist, am very interested in how the study of microbiota opens up new ways of thinking about living organisms. But a much better way to explain what I'm interested in is to say I'm interested in trouble. And I'm interested first and foremost in the trouble that you cause. By studying microbiota, you basically problematize or bacteriologize physiology. So we saw a great example yesterday with C. elegans. I was falling from my chair, I had read all these papers by Sidney Brenner. I had no clue that this was sterile. So by introducing the microbiota, you basically trouble a physiological system that was taken for granted. So there is some conceptual turbulence. One cannot think it the way one has thought it before, and I'm interested in that trouble. However, I'm also interested in the trouble that microbiome research introduces with respect to anthropology. And the best way to explain what I mean by this is to introduce it to a distinction that is the result of my own trajectory as anthropologist. So I make it a distinction between anthropology type 1 and type 2. So Thomas, I dropped anthropology 1.0 and 2.0 because that's what I had before. But when you speak about 2.0, you really don't want to be 1.0. And so I had to change that in order to not create too much trouble with my anthropology colleagues. So anthropology 1.0 is about faraway others. This is actually a group of Aranda people living in Central Australia. I've worked about them. This is the kind of anthropology you all know. So this is anthropology that is about faraway others, about their social structure, so how they live or organize their social living together, and about their culture or cultural beliefs. So as I said, I did that, but over the last 15 years or so, something I call anthropology 2, or anthropology type 2, has emerged. And this other anthropology is interested in the question, are today new forms of thinking and knowing in general, and about the human in particular, emerging? And by saying new, I really mean like emphatically new, i.e. new in the sense that they escape the already thought and the already known. Okay? That break the already thought and known open. As anthropologists, I'm very interested, if you will, in situations in which how we have known humans get troubled and humans get released from the way in which they have been known thus far. So another way to describe it is to say I'm interested in ruptures or in categories of thought, i.e. in trouble. And one easy way to explain what that's all about is to refer you to this. You should right now, when you have your laptop, all go to Amazon and buy this. It was just released last week. It's a book I wrote called Plastic Reason, and this is a study of how the discovery of adult cerebral plasticity in general and of adult neurogenesis, so the birth of new neurons in the human brain, has troubled or changed the ways in which neuronal researchers can think about the brain. So how the brain functions, how the brain gets thick, thick too, but how the brain gets sick, how we get sick, and how the ways in which neuronal researchers can explain human beings and how they orient themselves in the world has been changing. So a very brief example. The chemical synapse, or the release and uptake of chemicals across the synaptic cleft, was for 50 years or for 80 years, depending on how you want it. It's the major way to understand how a brain works. The discovery of adult neurogenesis, i.e. the birth of new neurons, but also the continuous sprouting of axons and dendrites, or their dendritic spines, little hair that get thicker and thinner in the course of the day. All of these dynamic elements have basically decentered this exclusive focus on the synapse and have opened up new ways of understanding how the brain works. Depression is the most prominent example. Depression was for a long time a chemical disease when it was so not enough of a given neurotransmitter, in that case serotonin. And over the last 5 years, roughly, depression has been redescribed as a plastic disease. So if you're depressed, the number of new neurons in your dentine gyrus goes down, which means you're way less open. You cannot take in new information. You get depressed, literally disinterested in the world. And the major effect of neurotransmitters is actually to upgrade adult neurogenesis. So is a new way of explaining depression. So when this project, which occupied me for a very long time, came to an end, I became interested in the human. More specifically, I became interested in the question if one couldn't write a conceptual history of the human that focuses on instances in which the concepts we humans have available to think about ourselves are changing. And one has to understand here that every single word or metaphor that we humans have available to make sense of ourselves has a history. What I mean by this is, at one point in time, it was not known. No matter how central it seems to us today, how natural and obvious, it's very likely that it was not known. One example, most languages that we know of do not have a single word for the body. The body, as a physiologically integrated whole, is roughly 250 years old. Most other languages have had, historically, concepts for skin. They may have several words for skin. They may have a word for torso or for head or for limbs, but not sort of a body as in itself something. Okay? So imagine you live in a world that has completely different set of concepts available to think about yourselves. It's a dramatically different existence. And then also allow for the possibility that if it was different in the past, we might live in a moment in which the concepts we have available to think about ourselves are changing again. It's exactly this kind of change I'm interested in. So when you try to do a conceptual history of the human focusing on ruptures, you see that before 1750, very roughly, there is a general pattern. The pattern has been described by a guy called Claude Lévi-Strauss in a book called Race et Histoire, and he says basically almost every group we know of describes itself as human, and the further you go away from that group, the less likely humans are. The less likely people are described to be human by that single group. And we know all of this. The AfD is just showing a perfect example of how it was before 1750. But between 1780 and 1820, roughly, so it's obviously the age of the Enlightenment, a massive change occurs. And what's that change about? Well, under the impression of travel reports from far away, that's to say from a European perspective, overseas places, philosophers, notably in France, but also in Germany, begin for the very first time in human history to construct a universal concept of the human. That's to say, they're not saying we are humans, they are not. They're saying, hold on, we are humans, they say they are humans. What kind of language could we invent to describe both of us as humans? So it's the first time that an abstract universal concept of the human emerges, and it's at that time that the concept of humanity as an all-inclusive group is invented. It was not known to exist before. Okay, so this is a quick quote from Diderot, written in 1755. It's one Diderot, famous Enlightenment figure, issued together with a man called d'Alembert, the Encyclopédie. This is just a picture of the Encyclopédie, which is showing the système figuré des connaissances humaines. So it's a chart of the total knowledge of humans. So I translate this into English. If one bans the human or the thinking being and contemplator from the surface of the earth, this spectacle, this pathetic and sublime spectacle, which is nature, remains nothing but a scène triste et muette, a sad and silent scene. It's the presence of the human which renders the existence of beings interesting. The human is the first and unique term from which one has to start and to which one has to return everything. So if I schematize this, then Diderot says, on the one hand is nature. Nature is completely meaningless. It doesn't even have a sense of order because there's so many different ways in which you could order nature, you can forget it. That's never going to serve us anywhere. It's the human that matters. And the one thing that humans do that no other being in the world does is inventing meaning. It's the first time that someone says this, because before people assumed they live in a God-given cosmos and everything has like a God-given meaning. So this is a revolutionary act to say humans invent meaning. Okay. So over the next 50 years, especially two authors, Rousseau and Herder, invented a new technical term that was never before used to describe humans and say this meaning production of humans, we call it culture. So humans are cultural beings is the big claim. That's actually quite revolutionary and is usually referred to as the beginning of modernity. Why? Well, because it's easy to say others have culture, but what that moment involved was to say our way of being in the world, even our religion, is just a cultural expression too. So it's as if they were relativizing themselves, and this construction of a universal relativizing language usually refers to as the beginning of modernity. Anyhow, so sorry for that didactic professorial talk. But so one can draw up a simple schema of the concept of the human that emerged around 1800, and this is everything and everyone was part of nature for a long time. But at one point, humans break through nature, and everything that's above nature is culture. So one could say, from the perspective of the 19th century and of most of the human sciences, this is where you guys are. This is life science. And the human requires its own science, the cultural sciences. It's a separate dominant, or is a separate realm that requires its own science, okay? So the implication is basically that the human is more than mere nature, that the human is a cultural being. And to this day, so this is not how I see it, I'm just giving you a historical overview. To this day, this is the very logic of almost all of the human sciences, that we are social or cultural beings, and society or culture means more than mere nature. And there is a reproach involved in this, and the reproach is that the life sciences or biology can never explain what it means to be human. You really need the human sciences for that. Okay, so you can celebrate this as the breakthrough to the truth, right? This is what we discovered in the 18th century. Now we're happy, lean back, and that's it. But you can also say, well, strictly speaking, that's just another conceptualization of the human. There have been others before that cannot be easily explained with this, and there might be others in the future. So once I basically began to think of this as just a concept, so it's not truth, but a concept, I was reminded of this book. I don't know if most of you for sure have or know Flaubert and know he's a 19th century French writer. He wrote a book called Dictionnaire des idées reçues, Dictionary of Received Wisdom or Commonplaces. So he walked around Rennes and Paris where he lived and listened to what people were saying without thinking about it. And he wrote this really nasty dictionary about them and wanted to show how stupid people in reality are. And he said constantly that he was sick of the boring quality of most human beings. He called it les grands ennuis. So if you actually are in a position like me and you're interested in new ways of thinking, and then you discover that the human sciences basically stopped thinking around 1800, then you have a really hard time, because, you know, everything that you read another book that is saying science is socially constructed, religion is socially constructed, sausage selling is socially constructed, car making is socially... How often can you read this without being really bored and disinterested? And I have, you know, I think people should study the world in social and cultural terms, don't get me wrong, but I individually was looking for escapes or for trouble. And you can imagine when I show these slides at the human science meeting, they're like, I'm covered in rotten tomatoes. So, which is quite all right. So just when I was wondering about how I could escape, whether there wouldn't be ways in the world today that are of such a quality that they cannot be understood in the language of the human sciences, a friend, Alberto Sanchez from Montreal, sent me a paper by Detlefsen, Margaret McFall-Nye, and David Relman, published in 2007, that says the microbiome research calls for a complete re-examination of human physiology. In fact, it claims on just a page further that attributes that have been presumed to be human traits, so distinctively human, not shared by anyone else, have been shown to result from human microbiome interactions. It doesn't actually in the paper say what that could be, but I thought, oh wow, that could be a really exciting project. So the idea was, can I do an anthropology of two things? On the one hand, the re-examination of physiology in bacteriological terms, what I call bacteriologization of physiology, and can I, on the other hand, study how these changes introduce conceptual turbulences vis-à-vis the human as it has been known in the human sciences. Okay, so it's rupture or trouble on two levels. On the one hand, with respect to biology, and on the other hand, with respect to anthropology. So I give just a few slides as an example for the kind of trouble I'm interested in anthropology, in biology, and then I turn to anthropology. So let's take the immune system. This is actually the cover of a textbook that was for the first time published in the early 60s. By Sir Frank Macfarlane Burnet, an Australian, received the Nobel Prize for his conception of the immune system as being about the distinction of self and not self, and also for the formulation of the clonal selection theory of antibodies. So, beginning in the 30s, accelerating in the 40s, Burnet suggested that the recognition of self from not self is the very basis of immunology. Before that, before Burnet articulated these ideas together with Jerne, there was no such conceptualization of the immune system. It was called humerology, but there was a systematic argument that says the reason why, especially the adaptive but also the innate immune system emerged was to defend the organism from everything that surrounds it, right? Now, one could very easily say that every major discovery in immunology in the second half of the 20th century was entirely exhausted by this self-not-self distinction. And I just give you a brief walkthrough. So, in the 1950s, Macfarlane Burnet published a book called The Clonal Selection Theory of Acquired Immunity, which marks really a milestone, earned him the Nobel Prize. A few years later, Isaacs and Lindenman discovered the interferon. Then in the 1950s, Porter and Edelman, wherever Edelman's name is, discovered the structure of antibodies. The major histability complex was discovered by Doherty and Sinkernagel in the 70s, and then eventually the work of Bruce Beutler and Jules Hoffman related to toll-like receptors. All of this evolved around understanding how exactly the body fends itself off from microbes. Now enter the microbiome. Early in the 2000s, a man called Sarkis Mesmanian published a paper that suggested that there is an immunomodulatory molecule of symbiotic bacteria that directs the maturation of the host immune system. So what Sarkis basically suggested in 2005, I think, was that maybe the distinction between self and not self is not so accurate. It could be that some bacteria, symbiotic bacteria, of which we seem to have many, are actually involved, at least in modulating the maturation of the immune system. He didn't go very far. He didn't claim yet saying that bacteria are part of the immune system or bacterial molecules are. He just said modulation. A year later, and it's 10 years now, which is kind of incredible, Margaret published a paper called Care for the Community, in which she basically suggested that perhaps the adaptive immune system is, after all, not a self-recognition system as much as it is an ecological management system. So imagine it as a kind of a consortium that integrates bacteria into the meta-organism, as it were, and imagine further that this consortium that manages that integration, that mutual integration, is not only composed of the human immune system, but also of bacteria, so that there is a genuine coming together. A few years later, Sarkis published another paper, Has the Microbiota Played a Critical Role in the Evolution of the Adaptive Immune System, and says himself that there are many microbiota that do not trigger an inflammation, rather they contribute to various aspects of host development and enhanced immune function, and he actually spells those out. And here he says, The distinction between self and not self actually seems to not hold, because not self seems to be part of self. And then another 2 years later, Thomas published this paper, Rethinking the Role of Immunity Lessons from Hydra, in which he says, actually, it's not just the innate immune system, but not just the adaptive immune system, that is not a not self-recognition system, but it's also the innate immune system with its AMPs and RPPs that has evolved in response to the need for controlling resident beneficial microbes rather than to defend against invasive pathogens. So this is just a very short example to show that for 50 or 60 years, the immune system was a not self-recognition system, and the emergence of microbiome research significantly troubled that, and that's exactly the kind of conceptual trouble I'm interested in. I could have given a zillion other examples. I could have given the genome as an example, which was sort of imagined humans or all kinds of other animals were imagined as genomically autonomous. But as John has beautifully shown this morning, even the nuclear genome must be understood as a mosaic, and actually it must be understood as an still evolving, symbiotic event, so to speak. It's as if you understand the term environment not only in spatial terms but in temporal terms. I could have referred to the brain. Wolfgang gave a beautiful talk when I got my degree in neuroscience, and I would have said that 95% of the serotonin, or 5-HT, actually in our brain comes from our gut. They would have expelled me from the class, and that was only a few years ago. I could have referred to evolution. Eugene and Ilana are in the room, no need to say more. C. elegans, I'm really grateful I learned that yesterday from Hinrich. I could have referred to development and the deductive quality that bacteria have, from sponges to squids to possibly humans. It's going to be really interesting. And one could describe this very generally as the bacterialization of physiology. Okay. What about anthropology? Because now I gave sort of a discipline internal talk. I think as anthropologist I have three further interests in this. And the first is that in an almost classical way, think of it as a sociology of knowledge, I'm very interested in how momentum was gained, and scientists like Margaret in particular, Jeff Gordon, Marty Blazer, and a couple of others have succeeded in institutionalizing or in building an infrastructure that allows for the international emergence of microbiome research. That happens never like this. It was not enough to invent the soap. You had to teach people how to wash their hands. So you can have great ideas, but to actually bring them into the world, it requires a lot of institutional labor. So I'm very interested in that. Second, I'm interested in the conceptions of the human that were silently transported by biology and that are disrupted or derailed by microbiome research. And I take the self-not self distinction, and you all know this guy. This was actually yesterday, it was on Wednesday. So if I do not know where Thomas ends and where his microbiome begins, then there is a kind of indistinguishability, a space in the middle. And I'm very, very interested in thinking from the perspective of that indistinguishability, trying to understand what it means human from the perspective of this indistinguishability. And so if I relate this back to the immune system, the concept of the human that the immune system traditionally has transported is as an autonomous, self-autonomous, bounded individual, cut off, capable of making self-autonomous decisions. If I think from the perspective of an indistinguishability, the human comes into view as a holobiont or a meta-organism, and this meta-organism exceeds the human, and what a self is totally up for grasps. We right now have no clear language for this. There's a third layer that concerns anthropology itself, and that is the question, are conceptions of the human that are that anthropological concepts silently transport, so built into the culture concept is a definition of the human as more than mere nature, are such conceptions of the human actually suited to understand the conception of the human that emerges from microbiome research? So can I describe microbiome research as a cultural formation? Or do I exactly lose what microbiome research is about, namely the indistinguishability of humans and microbes in a completely natural context, so that the human is not more than mere nature? And can I, as anthropologist, develop a language to make that visible and livable? So it's an anthropology after the human as it was constructed in the late 18th, early 19th century. It's an anthropology after the nature-culture distinction. And I do think that microbiome research is today one of the most potent sites for reconfiguring what it is to be human in a living world. I now could open a huge moral digression and say, in the age of climate change, do you really want to be a cultural anthropologist, i.e. setting humans apart from the natural world? Or would you want to try to elaborate conceptions of the human or of technology that are not opposed to nature, but that happen, so to speak, from within? Seems to me a good moment to ask such questions. I have to say that this is not a naive embrace of the microbiome from me. In a certain way, I'm much less interested in the microbiome as the breakthrough to truth. There have been so many breakthroughs to the truth that I'm always suspicious about this. I'm primarily interested in it as a conceptual event. And one way to explain what I'm interested in is simply, and that's a segue into the next talk, is to call it after Cézanne. My MA thesis was about the emergence of landscape painting in Europe. And I always was intrigued by Cézanne, who painted humans basically as if they're a part of the natural environment, right? He painted humans as if they were just another bush or a bunch of grass. However, he maintained contours. And if microbiome research is imagined as the dissolution of those contours, then what does it mean to be human in a living bacterial world today is precisely one of the questions that is philosophically and anthropologically speaking at stake in your research, but I do think that it's not always on the top of your mind when you do experiments. And that's why I do think a conversation between you and us, or me, is actually very, very interesting, and I'm very grateful to all of you who have invited me to their labs or have allowed me to speak to you. So, right now we have no words, but it's going to emerge. Thank you. And I'm happy to take questions.
Somebody wants to have some words? Anybody, not somebody?
Well, I'll say some words. I'm not sure how interesting they'll be, but anyway, that was a phenomenal talk, very thought-provoking. Just a comment about, in the context of symbiosis research, related to the early ideas that mitochondria were derived from bacteria. I mean, there was a period of time when, sort of 1910, 1920, French guy Lumiere came up with ideas that mitochondria were not actually derived from bacteria, but they literally were bacteria, and that they played all sorts of interesting roles in human biology to do with, disease, speciation, lots of things. There's various threads along those lines. But what's interesting and related to what you talked about in some ways is that the pre-existing framework for thinking about bacteria and microbes at that time was very much along the lines that microbes were bad. The Pasteur Institute learning about disease and the role of microbes, that whatever bacteria or whatever mitochondria were, they couldn't have anything to do with bacteria simply because they're bad, and that can't possibly have anything to do with human biology. Yeah, so it's an example of that I thought you'd find interesting.
Yeah, I mean, one example for me is Ilana's and Eugene's work, sort of the discovery of how bacteria make corals immune to certain diseases, right? It was a massive change of perception, so to speak, yeah.
So I would just like to make a comment, which is that in a sense, you're taking humans off their pedestal in relation to the microbiome, and it occurs to me that this is happening in parallel with a lot of developments in animal behavior that are taking humans off the pedestal in that sense, in relation to, I mean, it wasn't so long ago that only humans used tools, and then only humans made tools, and then only humans were conscious and were much more aware of independent evolution of these processes as well. And so maybe there's an opportunity to bundle up these
Absolutely.
multiple different ways in which we should stop thinking as humans as being separate.
That's exactly
it's just
right.
a comment.
And there is
and it
actually-
relates to brain function too.
and this is great. So I'm by no means the only person who says things like I just said. There is a fairly small but also robust group of anthropologists, and I do think that in the 18th century humans were delimited from two things. One was machines, it's very important, and the other one was animals. And animals were imagined as machines, which is also interesting. But today, because of cognitive behavioral biology, this is partly changing, and conceptions of thought or of language and communication are emerging that erase that boundary. And in artificial intelligence, there is actually also a challenge of the human. And so there is a small group of us that is exactly working on these things, and most of my students are working on either one or the other. Yeah.
Good, I'm afraid we have to move on.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Tobias is here for the party.